She didn't marry him for love. At least, not the kind people like to talk about. She married him for safety. That was how it began. Not with obsession, not with passion, but with relief. He was calm, controlled, certain. Being with him felt like stepping into a world where nothing unexpected happened, where decisions were made quickly, where problems disappeared with a phone call. After years of instability, that certainty felt intoxicating. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything directly, never showed jealousy the way people expect. His power was quieter than that. He listened carefully, observed silently, then decided, and his decisions shaped everything around him. At first, she felt chosen. He introduced her to a life she had only seen from the outside: private dinners, restricted spaces, people who treated her differently just by standing next to him. She learned quickly that proximity to wealth changes gravity. Rooms lean toward you. Doors open before you ask, and she adapted. She learned how to dress for discretion, not attention. How to speak less, but precisely. How to be present without taking up space. He never told her to change. That was the dangerous part. He simply rewarded the versions of her that fit his world. When she was agreeable, things flowed easily. When she questioned, the atmosphere cooled, not dramatically, subtly. Silence replaced warmth. Distance replaced closeness. She adjusted without realizing. She told herself it was maturity, growth, learning to live in a different world. People admired her restraint, her elegance, how well she handled his lifestyle. They said she was lucky. She believed them, because from the outside, everything looked perfect. The house was immaculate, the staff invisible, her life effortless. But inside the house, time moved differently. Silence stretched. Conversations stayed functional. Affection felt scheduled. He was always there, but never fully present. When she spoke about her feelings, he listened politely, then redirected the conversation toward solutions. If she felt lonely, he suggested activities, trips, purchases. If she felt unsure, he reassured her with structure, plans, certainty. He didn't understand emotional ambiguity. He managed it. And slowly, she learned that emotions without purpose were inconvenient. She stopped bringing them up, not because he forbade it, but because nothing changed when she did. She began to feel like a guest in her own life. Every detail was perfect, every surface polished, yet nothing felt lived in. The house didn't reflect her. It reflected his success. Her name existed inside his world, not alongside it. She began to disappear in small ways. Her opinions softened. Her preferences became flexible. Her spontaneity faded. Not because she was unhappy, because unhappiness would have been easier to recognize. What she felt was something quieter, erosion. She noticed it first in moments of absence, when she laughed with friends and felt guilty afterward, when she missed a version of herself she couldn't quite remember. She started measuring herself by how little disruption she caused. Peace became her responsibility, and peace required her silence. He never noticed the change, or perhaps he did, and preferred it. She began to notice how the world around her had narrowed, not abruptly, not violently, gradually. Her schedule was full, yet her life felt smaller. Dinners were planned weeks in advance. Trips were efficient, flawless, forgettable. Every experience curated to avoid discomfort. Spontaneity disappeared first. She stopped making last-minute plans, stopped saying yes without checking, stopped acting on impulse, not because he asked her to stop, but because unpredictability disrupted the order he valued so deeply. When something unexpected happened, he didn't get angry. That would have been easier. He became distant, quieter, colder, and that distance felt worse than conflict. She learned to anticipate it. She learned that harmony depended on her ability to adapt, to smooth edges, to absorb tension without naming it. She told herself this was compromise, that this was what adult relationships looked like at the top. But something inside her resisted. She felt it in her body before she understood it in her mind. A tightness in her chest when she heard his footsteps. A subtle relief when he traveled for work. A strange guilt for enjoying her own freedom when he wasn't there. The house was enormous, yet she felt watched by its stillness. Staff moved quietly. Rooms echoed. Nothing belonged to her completely. Even her personal space felt provisional. She began to miss noise, mess, imperfect moments that didn't need approval. She realized that everything in her life now had to justify itself. Time had to be productive. Emotions had to be reasonable. Needs had to be efficient. Anything excessive felt indulgent. Even joy. When she tried to talk about this, he listened attentively. He always listened, but listening wasn't the same as receiving. He asked questions that led toward resolution, not understanding. He reframed her feelings into problems that could be solved. And once a problem was solved, the conversation ended. She felt foolish bringing things up again, like someone repeating a complaint that had already been addressed. So she stopped. She began to feel invisible in conversations that were technically about her. Her life was discussed, planned, optimized, but she was rarely consulted. Decisions were made for her benefit, for her comfort, for her protection, and all of it came wrapped in generosity. How could she object? She had everything people dreamed of: security, status, a life without financial worry. So she questioned herself instead. She wondered if she was ungrateful, too sensitive, too emotional. She reminded herself that he had given her a world few people ever entered, and yet she felt like a visitor inside it. Her identity began to blur. She noticed she introduced herself differently now, more carefully, less personally. Her stories shortened, her opinions softened. She became fluent in neutrality. And neutrality, she discovered, was the safest position in a world built around power. The more she disappeared, the smoother things became. The smoother things became, the less space there was for her. This feedback loop tightened quietly until one day, something small broke through. She caught herself looking at her reflection longer than usual, not examining her appearance, but searching for recognition. She looked composed, elegant, untouchable, and deeply unfamiliar. She realized then that she wasn't unhappy in the traditional sense. She wasn't suffering. She was vanishing, and that terrified her more than pain ever could. She began to measure her words before speaking, not carefully, strategically. She learned which topics kept the atmosphere neutral, which questions led to polite disengagement, which emotions shortened conversations. She stopped sharing thoughts that didn't have a clear solution, stopped voicing doubts, stopped asking for reassurance, not because she didn't need it, but because needing something without a clear purpose felt like a burden. He never told her she was too much. He never had to. His silence did that work for him. When she spoke about feeling lost, he nodded, thoughtful, then suggested structure, schedules, projects, goals. He believed disorientation was inefficiency. She tried to follow his logic. She told herself that feelings could be managed the same way businesses were. That clarity would come if she organized her life better. But emotions don't respond to optimization. They accumulate. She started feeling tired in ways sleep didn't fix. Emotionally heavy, mentally foggy. The days blended together. Perfect, identical, empty. She noticed how rarely she laughed now. Not politely, not socially. Really laughed. When she did, it surprised her, and then embarrassed her, as if joy were inappropriate in a life built on composure. She became careful with friendships. Some drifted away naturally. Others felt awkward now, strained by differences she couldn't name. She avoided conversations that might invite questions, because answering honestly would require saying things she wasn't ready to admit. She didn't want to hear herself say them out loud, because once spoken, they would become real, and reality would demand action. She felt loyal to him in a way she couldn't explain, not romantic loyalty, structural loyalty. He had built the world she lived in. Leaving would mean dismantling everything, her lifestyle, her identity, her sense of safety. She wondered who she would be without his name attached to hers, without his protection, without his resources. That thought frightened her, not because she was incapable, but because she had slowly been convinced that independence was unnecessary. He handled things. He decided. He knew better, and over time she had believed him. She noticed how uncomfortable she felt making decisions alone now. Small ones, large ones. Choice had become foreign. She caught herself waiting for permission that was never explicitly required, and that realization shook her, because it meant the control was no longer external. It was internalized. She was policing herself, adjusting automatically, anticipating expectations, reducing friction before it appeared. She understood then that leaving wouldn't be dramatic. There would be no fight, no confrontation, just consequences, quiet ones. She would lose access, status, comfort, and perhaps something more frightening, the certainty she had mistaken for love. She wondered if what she felt was fear or clarity. She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. If she stayed much longer, there would be nothing left to save. Her body began to speak long before she found the words. It wasn't dramatic. No panic attacks. No breakdowns. Just signals. A constant tightness in her shoulders. A shallow breath she had to remind herself to deepen. A fatigue that followed her even on days with nothing to do. She told herself it was normal. Adjustment. A new lifestyle. But her body relaxed in his absence. When he traveled, something in her softened. She slept better, moved freely through the house, and that frightened her. Because relief should not come from distance, she began to notice how alert she felt around him, not afraid, attentive, as if she were always on standby, waiting to respond, waiting to adapt, waiting to align. That state never turned off. The anxiety was quiet, but persistent, like background noise you stop noticing until it disappears, and only then realize how loud it was. She started forgetting small things, misplacing objects, losing track of conversations. Her mind felt crowded. At night, she lay awake replaying moments from the day, analyzing tone, reconstructing expressions. Had she said too much? Had she been too distant? Had she disrupted the balance? These questions circled endlessly. She tried to dismiss them, tried to rationalize, but the body doesn't negotiate. She developed a habit of sitting alone in the quietest room of the house, not scrolling, not reading, just breathing, as if she needed to remind herself she existed beyond function. In those moments, a strange clarity appeared. She imagined leaving, not emotionally, practically. Where would she go? What would she take? Who would she call? The images were vague, incomplete, but they returned more often. She didn't label them plans. She called them thoughts. Harmless, temporary. Still, she began to notice exits, paths, options she had never needed before. She started keeping small things separate. Personal items, documents. Nothing obvious. Just enough to feel prepared, without admitting for what. She told herself it was precaution, not intention. He noticed none of this, or perhaps he noticed and assumed it was passing. He trusted the structure he had built, the comfort, the dependency. Why would she leave? She had everything. And that was precisely the problem. She began to feel a quiet urgency, not panic, not rebellion, awareness, the kind that settles slowly and refuses to leave. She understood that the life she was living wasn't abusive in ways people recognize. There were no bruises, no shouting, no restrictions written down, only erosion, and erosion is difficult to explain, especially to yourself. But once you feel it in your body, it becomes impossible to unfeel. She hadn't decided to leave. Not yet, but she had stopped convincing herself that staying was harmless, and that shift, subtle and internal, changed everything. She became careful about being seen, not physically, emotionally. She learned how to smile without revealing anything, how to speak without inviting questions, how to appear present while remaining distant. Disappearance, she realized, didn't require isolation. It required neutrality. She told herself this was sophistication, elegance, the price of moving in powerful circles. She watched other women around her, composed, quiet, perfectly adjusted. She wondered if this was what success looked like from the inside. No one complained. No one disrupted the order. And she understood why. In a world built around power, discomfort is inconvenient. So she adapted further. She minimized her reactions, lowered expectations, stopped wanting things she couldn't justify. She told herself she didn't need much. That simplicity was maturity. But it wasn't simplicity. It was reduction. She stopped talking about her past, about the version of herself that existed before this life. That version felt irrelevant now, almost embarrassing. She wondered if that woman had been naive, too expressive, too hopeful. This new life demanded restraint. She told herself that disappearing a little was the cost of belonging. Then someone noticed, not dramatically, not confrontationally. It was a small moment, almost forgettable. A woman she hadn't seen in years looked at her carefully and said, "You seem quieter." The comment landed harder than she expected, because it wasn't judgmental, it wasn't curious, it was observant. She laughed it off, said life had slowed her down, that she was just more settled now. The conversation moved on, but something in her didn't. That night, alone, she replayed the moment. The tone, the absence of accusation. Someone had seen the difference, and that terrified her, not because she was exposed, but because it meant she hadn't imagined everything. The disappearance was visible. She began to notice how often people described her using passive words. Calm, easy, low maintenance, compliments that felt oddly diminishing. No one asked what she wanted. They praised how little she needed, and she had helped create that image. She realized she had become someone who was easy to keep, because she took up no space. That understanding brought an unfamiliar emotion. Anger, not loud, not explosive, focused. She didn't express it. She observed it. Anger, she realized, was energy, and she hadn't felt energy in a long time. She began to understand why the idea of leaving had become persistent. It wasn't rebellion. It was self-preservation. She wasn't trying to escape him. She was trying to recover herself. But recovery would require being seen, and being seen felt dangerous. Because once you are visible, you can no longer pretend you are fine. She hadn't decided anything yet, but the narrative she had been telling herself, that this life was simply quieter, simpler, better, no longer held. Someone else had seen the gap, and now she couldn't unsee it either. He sensed the shift before she spoke, not because she announced it, but because she became less predictable. She hesitated more, paused longer before answering, withdrew slightly from the rhythm he had set. That was enough. He didn't confront her, didn't accuse, didn't demand explanations. Instead, he became attentive, asked how she was feeling, noticed small details, mentioned how quiet she had been. The concern sounded genuine, and that made it dangerous. She felt seen, finally, and immediately questioned herself. Maybe she had been unfair. Maybe she had misinterpreted everything. Maybe this was just a phase. He talked about how much he relied on her, how stable things felt with her by his side, how rare it was to find someone who understood his world. These statements weren't dramatic. They were soft, measured, and they carried weight. She felt responsible for his comfort, for the balance of the house, for the smooth functioning of a life built around certainty. She didn't want to disrupt that. She didn't want to be the reason something broke. When she hinted at needing space, he listened quietly, then reminded her, gently, of everything they had built together, not as a threat, as a fact. The life they shared was complex, intertwined, difficult to untangle. He never said she couldn't leave. He didn't need to. He simply made the cost visible. She imagined the consequences again: loss of status, loss of comfort, loss of identity, and something else, loss of purpose. Who would she be without this role? That question shook her. She had spent so long adapting to his world that she no longer trusted her own instincts. He framed her doubts as stress, as exhaustion, as something temporary. He suggested rest, travel, change of scenery, anything but change of structure. And for a moment, she almost agreed. She almost convinced herself that staying was easier, that leaving was unnecessary drama, that disappearing a little was a fair trade for safety. She felt the old guilt return, the urge to minimize, to adapt once more. But her body resisted. The tightness returned, the shallow breath, the quiet panic she could no longer ignore. She realized that this pattern, attention, reassurance, subtle pressure, wasn't new. It had happened every time she drifted too far from the version of herself that fit his life. She wasn't being pulled back with force. She was being guided, and guidance, when it erases choice, becomes control. That realization didn't make her brave. It made her tired. Too tired to keep pretending. She understood then that if she stayed, the disappearing would continue. Slowly, politely, permanently. She hadn't decided how or when, but she knew this. She couldn't survive another cycle. She didn't announce her decision. There was no moment of clarity that felt heroic. No surge of courage. No speech rehearsed in her head. What she felt was resolve without drama. A quiet line she refused to cross again. She stopped trying to explain herself, stopped negotiating internally, stopped asking permission from a life that had never truly been hers. Her preparation was invisible. She didn't pack bags, didn't move money, didn't create scenes. She created certainty. She repeated the truth to herself until it stopped shaking. This is not love. This is not safety. This is erasure. The days that followed felt surreal. He was kind, attentive, present in a way that almost convinced her to stay. That was the most difficult part. When he smiled at her, when he spoke softly, when he touched her hand without expectation, she felt doubt rise. Not because she wanted him, but because familiarity is persuasive. She imagined staying again. Imagined the comfort, the predictability. Imagined disappearing just a little more, slowly enough not to notice. The thought made her nauseous. She realized then that comfort had become dangerous. It no longer represented peace. It represented surrender. She began detaching emotionally before doing so physically. She observed instead of reacting, listened without absorbing, smiled without committing. This distance wasn't punishment. It was protection. She noticed how quickly he sensed it, how his presence intensified, how the space between them felt threatening to him. He didn't push, he reminded, of shared history, of loyalty, of how much he trusted her. Trust, she realized, had always flowed one way. She felt the old guilt try to return, the instinct to reassure, to soften the impact. But this time, she stayed still. She didn't owe anyone her disappearance. She understood that leaving wouldn't be an escape. It would be a reconstruction, and reconstruction requires loss. She stopped fantasizing about a painless exit. There would be none. She would hurt him. She would disappoint others. She would lose access to a world that once defined her. And still, she would be alive. That thought grounded her. She began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Presence, not happiness, not relief. Presence. Her body responded first. Her breath deepened. Her shoulders loosened. She wasn't free yet, but she was no longer gone. And that made the choice irreversible. She didn't leave immediately. That surprised her. The decision was made, but the movement took time. She stayed physically present while already gone inside. This in-between state was exhausting. Every interaction felt doubled. What she said and what she meant, what she showed and what she withheld. She noticed how much energy it took to remain neutral, to not react, to not soften, to not reassure. She had spent years managing his comfort. Now she was learning to tolerate his discomfort. That was new. He sensed something was different, but couldn't locate it. The structure was intact, the routines unchanged, yet something essential had shifted. She no longer adjusted herself automatically, no longer anticipated his needs before her own. That subtle change destabilized the balance. He asked more questions, checked in more often, increased proximity, not aggressively. Persistently, she began to understand how deeply the system relied on her compliance. Her quiet presence had been a stabilizer. Without it, everything felt slightly off. She saw it in small moments, how silence lingered longer, how conversations lost their smoothness, how he seemed less certain, not outwardly, but internally. And for the first time, she saw him clearly, not as powerful, not as impressive, but as someone deeply uncomfortable with loss of control. This realization didn't make her angry. It made her sad. She had mistaken his certainty for strength. Now she recognized it as rigidity. She wondered how long he had needed her to stay smaller, not consciously, structurally. She began to grieve, not the relationship, but the illusion, the belief that luxury equaled safety. That stability meant care. That silence was peace. She mourned the version of herself who had believed that. That grief came in waves. Some days she felt calm, focused, resolved. Other days she felt fragile, nostalgic, unsure. She questioned herself relentlessly. Was she exaggerating? Was she ungrateful? Was she about to destroy something good? The absence of obvious harm made everything harder. There were no scars to justify her leaving. Only absence, only erosion, and erosion is invisible until there's nothing left. She noticed how often she tried to minimize her own experience even now. Old habits clung tightly. She caught herself thinking, it wasn't that bad. Other people have it worse. I should be able to handle this. Then she felt the familiar tightness return, and she stopped. She reminded herself that survival is not measured by comparison. She didn't need permission to want more than comfort. She began quietly reclaiming pieces of herself. Small things, listening to music he never liked, taking longer walks, making decisions without explanation. These moments felt insignificant and revolutionary. Each choice strengthened something inside her that had been dormant, agency. She realized how foreign it felt to act without justification, how deeply she had internalized the idea that every choice must be reasonable to someone else. She was learning, slowly, to tolerate being misunderstood. That was harder than she expected, because being misunderstood felt like danger. But danger didn't arrive. The world didn't collapse. She was still standing, and that realization created space. Space where fear had lived. Space where clarity could grow. She hadn't left yet, but she was no longer negotiating with herself, and that meant the ending, when it came, would not be impulsive. It would be irreversible. He felt the imbalance before he understood it, not as fear, as irritation. Something in the house no longer responded the way it used to. Conversations didn't flow. Silences lingered too long. He sensed resistance where there had once been alignment. That unsettled him. He increased presence without realizing, came home earlier, canceled trips, inserted himself into moments he had once ignored. Not to dominate, to stabilize. He told himself he was being attentive, that this was care. But attention, when driven by discomfort, becomes surveillance. She felt it immediately. Questions arrived wrapped in concern. How was she feeling? Was everything okay? Did she need anything? The words were gentle. The frequency was not. She noticed how often he positioned himself nearby, how conversations circled back to her mood, how he monitored the atmosphere as if searching for a leak. She answered calmly, briefly, without explanation. That unsettled him more. He wasn't used to ambiguity. He needed feedback, confirmation. Her neutrality denied him both. He began offering more, not affection, leverage disguised as generosity, plans for the future, improvements to the house, trips she had once mentioned in passing. Each offer carried an unspoken message. This life is still good. Don't destabilize it. She recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't connection. It was reinforcement. She declined gently, postponed decisions, delayed enthusiasm. Each deferral created tension. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He recalibrated. He reminded her, subtly, of how rare this life was. How many people would envy her position? How safe she was here. Safety. That word returned often now. She realized how carefully it was chosen. Safety implies danger elsewhere, risk, loss. He didn't threaten her with consequences. He implied them. She felt the old doubt stir. What if she was wrong? What if she was walking away from something irreplaceable? Then she noticed her body again. The tightness, the alertness, the shallow breath. Her body had already answered the question. She watched him closely now, not with resentment, with clarity. She saw how his calm depended on her compliance, how his generosity increased when he sensed distance, how his reassurance was always paired with reminders of cost. This wasn't malice, it was structure, a system designed to maintain balance at the expense of movement. She realized then that staying neutral was no longer possible. Her stillness was being interpreted as uncertainty. Uncertainty invited intervention. The space she had created was closing. She understood that there would be a moment, soon, when she would be required to choose, not dramatically, not publicly, but definitively. Either she would reassure him fully, return to the version of herself that kept the system stable, or she would disrupt it completely. There was no third option. That knowledge settled heavily in her chest. She felt fear, real fear, for the first time. Not of him, of herself, of whether she would have the strength to endure the aftermath. Because she knew now, leaving would not be forgiven quietly. It would be reframed, controlled, explained in ways that preserved his image. She would lose more than comfort, she would lose the narrative. And still, she understood something fundamental. If she stayed, she would lose herself permanently. That realization hardened into resolve. The next step wouldn't be preparation. It would be action. And action would change everything. The confrontation never announced itself. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic scene. It arrived disguised as conversation. He chose a quiet evening. Nothing urgent on the calendar. No witnesses. The timing was intentional. He asked her how she was feeling again. The same question, asked for weeks now. This time, she didn't soften it. She said she felt distant, disconnected, that something in her life no longer felt like hers. She chose her words carefully, not accusatory, not emotional, honest. He listened without interrupting, his expression calm, attentive. Then he responded, not to what she said, but to what it threatened. He reframed. He said everyone feels lost sometimes. That transitions are confusing. That doubt doesn't mean something is wrong. He spoke in generalities, universalized her experience, diluted it. She felt the familiar pull, the temptation to agree, to simplify, to retreat. But she stayed. She said it wasn't confusion. It was clarity. That word landed heavily between them. Clarity removed the possibility of management. He paused. Then he shifted tone. He spoke about stability, about how rare it was to build something that worked, about how fragile balance could be. He reminded her of what they had together, the life, the protection, the future already arranged, not as a threat, as an inventory. She realized then that this was the deepest disagreement they had ever had. Not about feelings, about reality. He believed her experience could be reframed until it disappeared. She knew it could not. She said she needed time apart, not space within the structure, space outside it. The silence that followed was different, not distant, focused. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his words were precise. He asked if she understood what she was giving up, if she realized how complicated things would become, if she was prepared for the consequences. Consequences, the word hung in the air, not spoken as punishment, as inevitability. She felt fear rise sharply, not because she didn't expect it, but because hearing it confirmed everything she had sensed. She answered quietly, yes, that was all. No explanation, no justification, just yes. He looked at her for a long moment, not angry, assessing. She saw then that he wasn't trying to stop her. He was deciding how to contain the disruption. That realization steadied her. She understood that the choice was no longer theoretical. It had crossed into action. There would be no undoing this conversation. No return to neutrality. Something essential had shifted. She felt grief, sharp and sudden, for the life she was leaving, for the person she had been while living it. But beneath the grief, there was something else, relief, not happiness, not freedom yet, relief at no longer pretending. She didn't leave that night. She didn't need to. The exit had already begun. And from this point on, everything that followed would be irreversible. After that night, the house felt different. Not colder. Controlled. Nothing was openly hostile. Nothing needed to be. He became efficient. Schedules adjusted without consulting her. Decisions happened elsewhere. Information arrived filtered, delayed, incomplete. She wasn't excluded dramatically, she was managed. The staff remained polite, attentive, distant in a new way. She sensed the shift immediately. Eyes avoided hers longer than usual. Conversations shortened. Questions disappeared. It wasn't cruelty. It was alignment. The system was recalibrating. He didn't punish her with anger. He withdrew access. Meetings she once attended were no longer on her calendar. Trips were postponed indefinitely. Future plans were spoken of in abstract terms, without her name attached. He never said she was being isolated. He didn't have to. Isolation doesn't need explanation when power controls context. She realized how quickly a narrative can form without resistance. People around them began to act as if she were unstable, overwhelmed, confused. No one asked her directly. They spoke gently, cautiously, as if she might break. He never lied. He simply allowed assumptions to bloom. He framed the situation as concern, as protection, as patience. She watched herself slowly disappear from her own life again, but this time she was awake. That awareness hurt more than ignorance ever had. She began to feel the psychological weight of the aftermath. Sleep came in fragments. Dreams repeated the same theme. Rooms without exits, doors that closed quietly. Her body stayed tense, alert, not afraid of him, afraid of erasure. She noticed how easy it was for others to accept the version of events that didn't include her voice. Comfort prefers simplicity, power prefers silence, and silence was being provided. She considered speaking up, correcting the narrative, defending herself. Then she understood the trap. Anything she said would be reframed as emotional instability, as proof that she needed guidance, not autonomy. He didn't need to silence her directly. The environment did it for him. She felt anger rise, clean, sharp. Not the kind that explodes, the kind that clarifies. She understood then that leaving would not be framed as her choice. It would be framed as inevitability, as something unfortunate that happened to him. She would not be the author of the story. She would be the problem it explained. That realization stripped away the last hesitation. She stopped waiting for fairness, stopped hoping for understanding. She focused instead on preservation. She began preparing in ways that couldn't be managed. Internally, she detached from the need to be seen accurately, detached from the desire to be remembered kindly. Those things belonged to a version of her that no longer existed. She wasn't leaving to be understood. She was leaving to survive. And survival, she was learning, does not negotiate with power. She began losing things without anyone ever taking them from her. Access disappeared first, then relevance, then recognition. Her presence became optional. She noticed it in the smallest details. Invitations that stopped arriving. Conversations that paused when she entered a room. Decisions that had already been made before she was informed. No one said she was no longer important. They simply acted as if she weren't. This kind of loss is difficult to explain because nothing tangible is taken. No objects removed, no titles revoked, only meaning. She realized how much of her identity had been borrowed, how much of who she was depended on proximity to his world. Without that proximity, she felt undefined. She caught herself questioning her own memories. Had she ever truly belonged here? Or had she always been temporary? She walked through the house slowly now, noticing things she had ignored for years. The symmetry, the restraint, the absence of warmth. Nothing reflected her, not even the spaces she had spent the most time in. She understood then that she had never been meant to stay, only to fit. This realization didn't arrive with anger. It arrived with grief. She grieved the version of herself who had believed she could merge into someone else's life without disappearing. She grieved the safety she had mistaken for care, the silence she had mistaken for peace. The loss wasn't of luxury, it was of self-continuity. She felt fragmented. Some days she woke up feeling resolute, almost detached. Other days she felt hollow, unsure, unanchored. The lack of confrontation made everything heavier. There was no moment to point to, no argument to replay. Just the slow erosion of presence. She began to understand why people stayed in situations like this longer than they should. Not because they are weak, but because the leaving requires letting go of an entire version of reality. She was grieving a life that was still physically intact. That grief felt disorienting. She wondered if she would ever feel whole again, if she would recognize herself outside of this structure. She stopped asking herself whether she was making the right choice. Instead, she asked a simpler question. Can I remain here without disappearing completely? The answer came quietly. No. That certainty didn't give her comfort, but it gave her direction. She didn't know when she would leave. She didn't know what she would lose in the process. She only knew that staying meant becoming someone she could no longer recognize. And that loss of continuity, of identity, of self, was one she could not survive. She was standing in the threshold now, not yet gone, but no longer belonging. And thresholds are unstable places. They demand movement. The rupture didn't come as a decision. It came as exhaustion. One morning, she woke up and realized she was no longer afraid of losing anything. That realization startled her. For so long, fear had been the glue. Fear of instability, fear of judgment, fear of becoming irrelevant. Now, fear felt distant. What remained was something quieter, a refusal. She refused to keep explaining herself internally, refused to keep rehearsing conversations that would never happen, refused to keep hoping the structure would soften. Hope had kept her suspended. Now it released her. She moved through the house differently that day, slower, more deliberate, not as a guest, not as a caretaker of balance, as someone already leaving. She noticed how little resistance there was. The house didn't react. The system didn't fight back. It simply absorbed her absence in advance. That hurt and clarified. She realized how replaceable her role had always been, how easily the structure adjusted without her input. There was no dramatic moment where someone stopped her and asked her to stay. That silence was the answer. She packed quietly, not everything, only what felt undeniably hers. Objects that carried memory instead of status. Clothes chosen for comfort, not appearance. Papers that confirmed she existed independently of him. Each item felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. She felt the final resistance rise inside her. Not doubt, grief. Grief for the life she had imagined she was building, for the years spent shrinking without realizing, for the version of herself that thought adaptation was love. She allowed herself to feel it fully. She didn't rush past it. Grief, she understood, was proof that something real had been lost, even if it had never been healthy. That evening, she stood in the doorway longer than necessary, not to look back, but to acknowledge the crossing. She wasn't escaping. She was ending something, and endings, even necessary ones, deserve to be witnessed. She left without announcement, without confrontation, without permission. The silence that followed her wasn't empty. It was complete. The world outside felt louder than she remembered, messier, less controlled, and real. The first days were disorienting. She woke up unsure of where she was. Then, relieved, when she remembered. Freedom didn't arrive as joy. It arrived as unfamiliarity. She had to relearn how to decide without justification, how to move without anticipating someone else's reaction, how to exist without being observed. The absence of structure felt like a vertigo. There were moments she missed the certainty, the predictability, the illusion of safety. In those moments, she reminded herself of the cost, the tightness in her chest, the constant alertness, the quiet erasure. She was not grieving luxury. She was grieving a version of herself that had survived by disappearing. Rebuilding was slow. She felt awkward in conversations, over-explained at first, apologized too often, then noticed and stopped. She began to feel her body again. Her breath deepened. Her sleep lengthened. Small preferences returned. Music she liked. Food she chose without negotiation. Silence that felt restorative instead of punitive. No one applauded her leaving. No narrative redeemed her publicly. Some people believed his version. Some didn't care enough to question it. And that was part of the loss. She learned that leaving power often means leaving the story behind as well. She would not be understood by everyone. And understanding, she realized, was no longer the goal. Integrity was. She didn't emerge untouched. She emerged aware. Aware of how easily comfort can become a cage, how subtly control can wear the mask of care, how luxury can numb the instinct to leave. She understood now that disappearance doesn't always look like suffering. Sometimes it looks like elegance, like stability, like a life others envy, and that is why it's so dangerous. She didn't regret leaving, but she respected what it had cost her. Not money, not status, the illusion that safety can be borrowed from someone else. She learned finally that the most expensive thing she had ever paid for luxury was herself, and walking away was the first moment she truly owned her life.